The dual mothership and the collapse of the survivor. In mirrored psychic conversion theory, MPIT, the psychic collapse experienced by the survivor of narcissistic fantasy is not incidental, behavioral, or circumstantial. It is structural. It is a collapse of the organizing principle of reality itself, triggered by the activation of a trauma encoded architecture that was laid down long before the narcissist ever arrived. Central to this collapse is the reactivation of what MPIT terms the ASR1 complex, the annihilatory stress reflex, sealed in infancy and reawakened during adult relational trauma. This psychic reflex, buried deep within the autonomic and symbolic layers of the psyche, is not simply a fear response, it is a totalizing symbolic reversal. A moment when the psyche abandons authorship and regresses into mirrored survival structures, built to appease and mirror an unregulated other. In the context of narcissistic collapse, this structure is reignited precisely because of the projection of what Professor Sam Vaknin has termed the dual mothership fantasy, a psychic split in which both parties become each other's primary caregiver and dependent child simultaneously. In this mirrored psychic inversion, the narcissist assigns the survivor the role of both mother to meet their unmet libidinal needs and child to reenact and displace the symbolic imprint of their own trauma. This dual mothership projection creates a symbolic feedback loop in which both parties are infantilized, fused, and psychically regressed. But with one critical difference: only one of them is structurally dependent on collapse to maintain their inner coherence, and that party is the narcissist. MPIT fully affirms Vaknin's insight. The narcissist must engineer a shared fantasy in which they install the other as both source and object of their survival. The dual mothership is not a metaphor. It is a neurosymbolic imprint, an internalized survival structure that seeks to outsource regulation, idealization, and containment. It is not a choice. It is the narcissist's only remaining pathway to coherence. But for the survivor, this psychic configuration is not native. It is induced, and it induces collapse precisely because it overlays the survivor's dormant trauma template, the ASR1 complex, sealed during early developmental trauma, often involving withdrawal, abandonment, overstimulation, or misattuned caregiving. The narcissist's shared fantasy becomes the trigger event that causes the survivor's internal ecosystem to flip from an adult authorship position into a childlike mirroring state, encoded around fear, longing, appeasement, and false self adaptation. This is where MPIT's contribution becomes critical. Vaknin provides the foundational map: dual mothership, shared fantasy, cold empathy, and introject deployment. MPIT builds on this map by showing how these projections penetrate the survivor's internal ego structure, activating symbolic compartments that were already compromised by early relational trauma. These compartments, what MPIT calls the redeemer ego, the mute child, the false protector, the internalized narcissistic introject, do not arise during the narcissistic relationship. They are exhumed by it. The narcissist doesn't create the collapse, they locate the hidden coordinates of collapse already stored within the survivor's affective and symbolic system. This is what makes the relationship feel so fated, so magnetic, so unspeakably powerful. It is not just two people falling in love, it is two survival systems, one narcissistic, one appeased, colliding at the site of unintegrated childhood trauma. And both are triggered, both collapse, but only one requires the collapse to survive. The survivor does not know this at first. The symbolic fusion feels like love. The duality of roles, caregiver and child, redeemer and dependent, feels romantic, spiritual maybe, intimate, but over time the survivor begins to feel the pull of an unspeakable exhaustion. They are being drained by the fantasy. Their psyche begins to fragment. And why? Because to remain in the fantasy, the survivor must perform both sides of the narcissist's demand. To be the all knowing mother and the compliant child, this is impossible. The survivor cannot remain in two symbolic positions without eventually collapsing under the strain. This is the point of psychic inversion, the moment where the survivor begins to regress, split internally, and adopt a symbolic position that is not their own. MPIT names this moment as the false self actualization of the survivor, where their authentic self is overwritten by a trauma adapted configuration that serves the narcissist's fantasy rather than the survivor's reality. It's at this precise moment that the shared fantasy completes its capture and the survivor's inner symbolic order is reversed. In clinical terms, this is not just codependency or trauma bonding, it is a collapse of internal authorship. The survivor no longer knows what they believe, feel, or want. Their emotional compass is rerouted around the narcissist's needs. Their sense of safety is derived from compliance. Their identity becomes a function of their gaze. This is the final expression of the dual mothership. You are no longer your own psychic center. From this point, the collapse continues. The survivor's libidinal system, their desire, vitality, erotic authorship, is redirected outward and captured by the narcissist's elation loop. Their anti-libidinal system, their rage, shame, self-protective affect, is turned inward, becoming self-blame, guilt, and internalized devaluation. The survivor's central ego splits, with one part trying to maintain the fantasy and the other silently screaming for truth, dignity, and escape. MPIT's symbolic framework allows us to track this descent through spotting, auditioning, idealization, devaluation, collapse, and finally extraction or death drive fusion. At each stage, the survivor is being pulled further away from symbolic authorship and deeper into a fantasy that replaces reality with a mirrored projection. Importantly, MPIT never proposes that the survivor is simply too sensitive or that the narcissist is too disordered. These are surface level interpretations that fail to capture the internal collapse occurring inside both parties. What MPIT and both Vaknin show in aligned integrated theory is that the shared fantasy functions as a regression field where both parties become infantilized versions of themselves and then co-create a world based on those distortions. But the narcissist has no intention of leaving the fantasy. For them, it is reality. The survivor, on the other hand, is left to carry the pain of both parties' trauma, both parties' projections, both parties' unmet needs. This is what makes recovery so excruciating. It's not just the loss, but the realization that you were never seen and only used as a psychic container. Recovery begins when the survivor exits the fantasy and returns to the self. MPIT provides that map for that return. And at every step, it affirms what Professor Sam Vaknin has shown that narcissism is not a personality quirk. It is a structural disorder of object relations, fantasy formation, and cold introject deployment. The dual mothership is not a metaphor. It is the mechanism by which collapse is engineered, and it is only by tracing that mechanism, symbolically and structurally, that we can truly heal. Peace out. Loads of love.